This is the topic, educating future designers. And so I'm actually curious about, what's the role of architecture school in preparing, students and future architects, for the future, which could be quite different than now. Both the world, because of maybe different things, climate change could be a big one, but it also is about our profession. How is our profession actually going to be different in the future that we are preparing the student to do? So I have actually some slides that you guys gave us, so we can go through them. Now, before we start to talk about the future, we have two speakers here. We have Christian Long with Wonder by Design, and he would talk a little bit about his background and what he does with Wonder by Design. And then we have Christy Bailey, I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with today, and she would talk about also her background a little bit. I don't know if you talk to a student about your background much, but maybe.
I try not to.
So I think before we had that discussion that I want to start with you guys talk a little bit about your background in terms of education. So how about Christy? You want to start first about your background a little bit before we jump to?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Does that work up there? Yeah. Cool. So I guess just for those that might not know, because actually there's a lot of faces in the audience that I think aren't students. So I'm an assistant professor here at the Knowlton School of Architecture. I teach design studios, theory seminars, and our core representation course. And yeah, so that's maybe the short answer. I think in terms of my background as an education as an architect, I think your first prompt was how did we get interested in architecture or something? And I always feel like there's kind of two camps of architectures, ones that sort of stumbled upon it via some other interest, and I am in the other camp, which is long before I even understood what an architect did or was, I wanted to be one. So from about 12 or 13, I became really interested in drafting in middle school. And so I kind of naively pursued my idea of what an architect was, even though I didn't know any architects in my, there were no architects in my life, and I think even at that time, probably not even my town or small town. So that took me to Philadelphia, the university. It was the Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science, was where I got a Bachelor of Architecture, a 5-year professional degree, which, just to add to the naivete of this story, that program was not an accredited program at that time. So for most of the people in this room who are probably architects or students who probably did a lot more research and legwork in terms of what's really important about an architecture school, accreditation is pretty important.
Right.
In terms of the possibility that you may continue into the profession as an architect. So yeah, at the time, Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science was one of the newest architecture programs, and you need to graduate a certain amount of classes until you can be eligible for the possibility of becoming an accredited program. I only say that just because I think we're going to get into some other things today, and I think that while it was kind of accidental, has been kind of thematic in terms of my education and education as a young practicing architect as well. It was just it felt like I was always around either institutions or architects who were kind of punching above their weight. And I think, having an architecture program with the ambition of becoming accredited but not being accredited is certainly, I think, an example of kind of punching above your...
Did they eventually get accredited?
Absolutely,
okay.
Yeah. Because of my...
Right, exactly.
Because of my work as a student,
Your alumni status.
Well, no, they have to use the body of work that's created in those first 5 or 6 years as proof that this is a program. So, they really, again, it was obviously an accident. I don't necessarily think it's a scenario that a student would want to choose. But I think what it did is it put me in an educational environment, which was figuring things out. Which, not only were it wasn't just a matter of fussing with the curriculum or developing the curriculum, it was a true scenario of creating a curriculum.
Right.
And again, of course, I didn't know all of that as a student, but that certainly is in the ethos of your education in terms of, it was a faculty that was comprised of mostly adjuncts in Philadelphia, so
Okay.
they had a very small core faculty at that time.
Just like here?
I'm just kidding.
Maybe opposite, maybe slightly different. But I just mean that was, so my education, just to wrap this up and to send it back to you, I think my education was in an urban environment in Philadelphia. It pulled from a large range of young adjunct, young practicing architects in the city. In parallel to a very committed and core group of professors who were looking to build a program.
Right.
And so I think that was sort of the foundation of how I was brought up into architecture.
And then you worked for a while after you graduated.
Oh, yes,
Right.
we're continuing. Okay. Yeah, and then following undergrad, I actually was fortunate enough to start working with one of the young professors who I had as a studio professor. And certainly the office was Erdy McHenry Architecture in Philadelphia, and Scott Erdy is actually a graduate of this program and incredibly supportive and still thinks and speaks very highly of the education that he received here. But it certainly was a scenario as a fresh graduate, out of school. It was two partners who had just broken away from 15 years of working at Hillier, which is a pretty large East Coast kind of corporate office, and they absolutely they both had young families. They were, I call them young, but they were about my age now. Kind of broke out on their own, went from their 15 years of kind of corporate practice to the attic of their house in Haddonfield, New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
And so again, not necessarily what I had planned,
Right.
but again, finding myself in the continuation of my education in an office, which was figuring things out.
Right.
They were absolutely punching above their weight at that time. I mean, we would go for projects that were way over our complexity level, way over our manpower, woman power level. We would get shortlisted and we would rent furniture and call our friends. I mean, we were absolutely not like building an environment
Right.
for projects that we hoped to get, as opposed to sort of playing out. These are our skills. We hope to get work that fits that. And so again, I think this is, I guess, it's a little bit retroactive to kind of look at those two things together. But there's an institutional model and a young office model that is whose ambitions are higher than the kind of
Right.
resources
Okay.
at that time. And I think both of them have absolutely contributed to how I think as an architect, how I operate as an architect, and I'm sure we'll get more deeply.
Now let me keep going, because then after that you went back to grad school, and is it very different experience from your standpoint, from your undergrad and also from working in Philadelphia?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So there was a 4-year span in between undergraduate and graduate school, which I think allowed me to become kind of hungry again for the academic environment, sort of bringing on new skills. And new skills were certainly required at that time, because the shift between my undergraduate was the late 90s to the mid 2000s. And so it also corresponded with kind of what we now would call like the digital turn. And so it's like now to look back on it, it seems like, oh, that was an interesting turn, but to be living it was, it was going into graduate school really felt like I had studied for 5 years, I had practiced for 4 years, and I felt like my hands were completely tied because the modes of representation had changed so drastically.
Okay.
And so again, I think that probably contributes to some of the things we'll talk about, how
Okay.
I think of curriculums, and it also has impacted absolutely my opinion about how much you you teach skills
Right.
versus how much you teach an ability to be resilient and agile and all
Yeah.
of those.
Okay. How about you, Christian? You want to jump in about your story?
Sure. Good evening. First and foremost, I'm not an architect, so I want to at least put that important detail on the table. I have the pleasure of working side by side with my partner at Wonder by Design. His name is Trung Lee, goes by Lee, and so we founded a studio with the premise that we were madly curious about the future of education and wanted to apply design and architecture to that question. And so Lee, in terms of this sort of two-person shop, embodies what it takes to execute architecturally. And if I embody a different side of that, it's how to translate and understand what it means to teach and learn going forward. So certainly very, very interested in the question of what it means to be agile and persistent and scrappy as a student of a program, but equally so what it means to walk into a business or design environment where the rules aren't, at the very least, they're ambiguous, and perhaps even more so, they're all disappearing. And so if we take digital and extrapolate out and try to imagine what's the value proposition for a licensed architect 25 years from now, that becomes complex. It becomes interesting to imagine why would somebody pay you for service to do what you've worked your tail off to become. And so this larger question of how do we think forward as designers and architects, I'm speaking on behalf of those who are, and then how do we apply that, a feedback loop through the field of education or studio practice and studio learning, I'm very, very interested in. I not only am not an architect, I really have no business being at the center of an industry that's tied so directly to architecture. I got here, I love this path of naivete that you spoke of, so I'll just hold on tight to that as a formal methodology. Not only did I get here through a tremendous amount of naivete, every time I attempted it, it failed. And the next obvious move wasn't to double down on that. The next obvious move was to leave design and architecture entirely, and then through some weird eddy in the stream, and then my own just ache, I suppose, ended up back in. So I'm a high school English teacher by training. I was a summer camp counselor and high school English teacher and varsity soccer coach, and really, really interested in the studio model, but I'll frame it slightly differently, the idea of school as base camp. So if studio is sort of the epitome of a great formal K-12 or tertiary educational program, for me the larger metaphor is to be out on trail, on an expedition, trying to solve in motion, and you launch from wherever you are, whether it be studio, office, project spec, team. You go out and solve through rigorous ambiguity, and then bring back and get ready to pitch, and then that cycle. So those are maybe some biased language. So my background was all as an educator, but I became very interested as an undergrad to talk about not doing research. I went into an interior design program as a sophomore at Indiana University because I couldn't figure out how you did design at IU when there wasn't a design program. There wasn't a school of architecture like here at OSU, Purdue, which we had great disdain for. We had nothing that even rivaled their worst programs. The only thing I could find was, and I was one of only 2 males in a program of probably 250 female undergraduates, which sounds nostalgically really compelling, but the truth was, I didn't know what I was doing. I was, without question, one of the least talented people there. And within 2 months, the professor who led the program, even though I had straight A's at that point, said, "What are you doing here? You have no business," which was a kick in the ego. But I also knew he was right. I had no business being there because I couldn't make use of the program. So then I turned to the most obvious place of poetry and Russian literature and studied that next, and then eventually circled into the field of education and then taught for a number of years. And it was from there that I became really interested in, can we design the environment so that people can thrive? And it was modest early on. It was, as a young educator, I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't believe the way that I was trained was the way forward. And I don't believe that what I was taught to do as a young professional is going to be much more useful for many more years. So how can we rethink what it means to create an environment so that individuals and then later as I started to think about how teams can thrive. So that has implications certainly in architectural space and maybe applying design towards the human construct, the ecology of X. So I'll end there.
Okay.
So thank you for the naivete. That for me was a good one to hold on to.
I'm really interested in what you said about the idea that you are coming from the education background, like you are a teacher, basically. That obviously you have a lot of ideas about how to teach them, how to motivate them, how to get them curious. And you even have. I'm sorry. And sorry about that. And so we're talking about, Christian have the background of being a teacher that, is really interested in how to motivate students, how do you get them curious and asking questions and get them to be interested in learning, basically. I mean, you even have you're part of an effort to create the book called Third Teachers about basically how to design schools to be the third teacher. I don't know who's the second teacher, but maybe I can ask later.
Sure.
So I'm actually curious to hear from your perspective, because obviously you work with architects for a while now, designing school, helping school to kind of conceptualize what they actually need, I suppose. How do you see the architects that you work with? What do you appreciate the most from their inputs, and on the other hand, what do you think is our weakness, being an architect trained in a certain system that we may be lacking in some way?
I'm going to gingerly avoid the second question until we get a little bit more momentum. I have my opinions, but I'm not, out of all respect, I'm not sure that's the right pivot. But I think it's an interesting question in the sense of how do we collectively and as an individual talent or a team, how do we constantly evaluate what our value is in a project or in a complex arrangement of teams or in the larger question of what does society need from us as designers, problem solvers, architects, engineers. So I'll defer by throwing that out as a rhetorical question. Our firm Wonder is accused of being an architectural firm. I work side by side with one of the leading school architects on the planet. He would never acknowledge that. I have no problem saying that out loud. We work and design schools and universities, YMCA's, libraries, and renovate and muck around with and conceptualize in ways that won't even be built. Learning environments all over the world. And the vast majority, 80 or 90% of those, start with an assumption that it's an architectural project. To solve our problem, we need architecture. A renovated space, reimagined sort of sense of campus master plan, a sense of trajectory of additions, population growth is going to affect who shows up, how many, what's the FF&E, how are we going to get this built on time, do we really need 50-year buildings and a 30-year bond, and does it need to be designed in the 18 months to be built in X? So the vast majority of our projects are architectural. We attempt never to sign an AIA contract, to be really blunt. From a fiscal and strategy and brand and a willingness to be happy and healthy, our goal is to never sign an AIA contract. On some level, that's sort of heresy, because how could you design a building and not sign the very legal designation of a building will be built, not just on time and under budget, but in a way, much like the medical profession, it's honorable and healthy and won't collapse on somebody.
But like you said, you're not an architect firm, so I mean, you can't really sign. I mean, it's not the
No.
scope of service.
My partner is,
Right.
and we could, and he's elected not to be architect of record on any of our projects, which is a moral and a strategic decision. The reason I say all that isn't so much to differentiate ourselves, because our daily peers and competitors are everybody, SOM, Perkins & Will. We both exited from Canon Design. So we were designing schools for the #1 ranked school architecture firm on the planet for a while. All of our peers, whether they're partners like Design Group here in town or our competitors, are the best and the best of A&E firms designing learning environments. And so we have to match them in terms of both execution and promise. But our goal, on the other hand, is not to assume, and this is the key part, that the solution is a building. Instead, that the questions of how do we approach campus and space and behavioral gestures and wayfinding and building forms, et cetera, may be the invitation, but ultimately what we're looking for is a spectrum of ways to approach that, and some of them may be architectural in nature, some of them may be explicitly about construction documents and literally a punch list and literally opening the doors one day. So from our vantage point, we never assume, no matter how explicit the client is, that the answer will be building. We always assume that the question of a building will invite us to wrestle with the right questions, as long as we don't get caught up in the object, but more importantly, focus on the interactions between.
Now, let me jump in a little bit, because I think, sorry, let me make sure that I'm close enough to the mic. So Christian, so I know you raised a very interesting point about building. Like you said, you don't want the answer to be automatically a building, right? And I think, and we kind of talked about this a little bit before about, architects. We go to school and we learn problem solving, we learn how to figure things out. And the reality of it is that not everyone become an architect at the end, right? I mean, you can go to art school and you may not be, following that career path, and you might do something else that end up not dealing with buildings. So I want to go back to Christy about the idea of the teaching in this setting, in the studio setting, that do you see that? I mean, do you see that a lot of your students or a lot of things that you guys are teaching in school may not necessarily end up being a building, or may not end up training a person to be an architect when they graduated from the program?
Yes. Okay. I think I'm aware of that most of the time. I would just step back 1 second just to say, if you're trained as a teacher and you have no business being an architect, I would say I'm trained as an architect. I probably have no business being a teacher. So I always find that that's an interesting mode of operation for a professor, where I have absolutely no formal training in teaching. In terms of I have no formal training in terms of how to motivate someone to learn or think on their own or with others, like all the things that I think are super valuable skills. So I'm definitely on the job training every day in that realm.
I feel the same way with being a parent.
Sure. Right, I think there's lots of things that we end up being quite good at that we're not formally trained, for. So I guess to your question in terms of, I guess the first part of the question is, am I aware as someone who's teaching architecture that I might be teaching people that might not become architects? And I think and I would say yes. I think I'm absolutely aware of that. And I think the second part of the question is, do I approach projects within either my small office and or my studio teaching that the artifact is not always architecture? And I would say absolutely yes. And I think it's, my sense is, although I think not everyone will become an architect in the traditional sense, not every project we work on is going to become a building, I do appreciate the value of expertise that we develop as people that are studying architecture and or practicing architecture. And I think one of many, but one of the expertise that I kind of work to develop in my students is kind of spatial expertise, the relationship of spaces, and that could be a building to a courtyard, a room to a room, an inside to an outside, a top to a bottom, the relationship of stage to audience, right? I think that those spatial relationships work at so many scales. Are these spatial relationships that one is meant to experience, i.e. move through? Does it move? Are these spatial relationships that bring on issues of scale? Like, is this an object that one is to move around? Is one to hop over? Like, what are those things? So I think the idea of thinking spatially, I think, is something that I foreground in a lot of my teaching, even though the extremes of scale that it might work on, I think change quite a bit. But I think that I do think it's important to go out into the world feeling like you have developed an expertise, even though you decide to deploy it in a multitude of ways. And I think that architecture still, our expertise is through modes of representation, through modes of making and working and thinking, is to translate ideas from like concept to 2D to 3D, to imagine three-dimensional space, communicate them two-dimensionally, look at three-dimensional space, I think it's a kind of a back and forth. So I think like spatial ambitions.
Now, do you think that is gonna change in the future? I mean, we talk about the changing future. We talk about that, student or architecture education is probably very different 50 years ago than it is now. And, obviously, we would expect that it would keep changing. How do you see it now? You talk about spatial. I mean, obviously, that's a fairly generic or universal issue that we have to deal with, whether you're an architect or not. Do you see that being a very core issue that we can hold on to? That we would not? It doesn't matter what comes to us in the future that might be different than now. That we will still always have to deal with what you just said about the spatial expertise in architecture.
I think that we're always going to be occupying our environment. And I think that while that environment might change and the ways and the speed of which we move through that environment, the amount of attention we are able to give to that environment, I think all of those things are going to change. And I think an architect needs to start to think about those things so that the way that one appreciated spatial qualities of a cathedral is a very different way than someone moves through an urban environment today, or the way that they move in and out of buildings, the amount of attention that they pay to those enclosures. And so I do think like the realm of what constitutes kind of boundaries is still an area that architects will work on. But I think it's going to change. I think it's not always just going to be an object as building, city as city. And I think there's been points in history when those things have gotten more merged than other times, and I think we're probably moving into one of those periods. But I still think that the need for the construction of full enclosure, partial enclosure, barriers, transitions, I think all of those things I imagine them still very much in our future, although they may change in terms of thickness and type and that.
Now, before we move forward, I know that we have some slides that we prepare. Do you want to talk about that? I have Christian one first. If you go to this one. So tell me about this.
Sure. This is a project that originated in Turkey. Technically, this is right on the river that divides Asia and Europe in Istanbul. This is a project where the design brief, the invitation to our team a couple of years ago, was designed the prototype middle school for all of Turkey. Right? It's a pretty kind of a badass invitation. Like, first of all, fly to the other side of the world where you aren't of that community, of that culture. Cultures is probably a better way of saying it. You are being charged with, while Istanbul would easily be targeted as a top 10 urban city, political, economic, sort of plate tectonic force in the world, the vast majority of Turkey is still in developing status. So most of Turkey is not thinking about ubiquitous Wi-Fi access. They're thinking about getting access to water. Istanbul, on the other hand, up until recently, 4 or 5 years ago, was really seen as potentially maybe the great fulcrum for the world in the next 50 years. So when they asked, could you design the prototype middle school for all of Turkey, that was an oh my invitation and exciting. And on one level, it's very architectural. All of those vertical forms that you see that sort of cover the window, the envelope and skin, change throughout the day, independent and collectively to mirror season, time of day, deal with shading. The building was obviously meant to be very organic. There are no hard rectilinear spaces, so the teacher would have her wall at the front and a bunch of rows. It's meant to be space is adapting to the intuitive needs of people. Yet, if you really look at the design brief, it wasn't about architecture. It was about how do we imagine the future of Turkey at the center of a very complex world. So for the first half of the project, we assumed that our ability to render a vision of the future was the answer. And I certainly am very proud of our team for coming up with a concept where the Ministry of Education and the Koç Foundation, which would be the equivalent of the Gates Foundation, they possess about 19% of Turkey's GDP. So a pretty important foundation to say design. So for the most part of the project, we told this story: space, place, material, etc. Next slide. Until a grandfather one afternoon in a school that ran to about the 6th grade, at the very beginning of the day, you would have seen calisthenics that would have felt very Soviet bloc, 1960. And then at the end of the day, drinking tea, this grandfather, big bear hug, came up and said, "I want to thank you for taking care of my granddaughter." And the project shifted a little bit. I offer this both as an anecdote about this project, but also about what it means to understand relevance and where that point of possibility is that when we really dug into the project and let go of the idea that the built environment would be our answer, therefore our validity, we instead started to think about what is this question for the future of Turkey. And the average 11, 12-year-old girl in Turkey has a really interesting unspoken and spoken challenge. It's a country that was defined in the last century as being explicitly non-faith-based, non-spiritual, non-religious. I mean, you go into a public building, you cannot wear your religious identity on your sleeve. At 11, 12, 13, the average girl who is Muslim by family and culture has to decide, do I stand for my family's faith designation, belief system, culture, or do I acclimate to the 21st century, to the new economy, to school? And it's a really interesting intersection. So while the first slide was how do you respond architecturally, what we soon realized a couple months in is the great design challenge wasn't design the building. To be honest, that was the easy part. And that was a very sophisticated project. The hard part was how do we ensure that no 12-year-old girl ever has to answer that question again? Which way do I go? But instead, what am I capable of? So that for me is a reminder. Next slide. We're really fascinated with how people use space. And I think in the same way that the relationship between daylight, indoor, outdoor, a sense of proximity, Edward T. Hall, how close are we in a culture before we get too close? And do I feel that I'm on a stage just because there's this, or do I need that to then define stage, et cetera? We're really interested in how people use space, not necessarily in the way we design for, but in the way we discover as spaces are used. So often if we're designing a space, we have to look at how people behave anyway, regardless of what spaces they have. And a story like this tells an interesting story, or it sparks different reactions. On one level, these young people today, how in the world can they keep organized? No wonder they lose their homework, no wonder they're multitasking, no wonder their cell phone, distracts them from the people like us up on stage trying to guide them. And as we really study, we start to realize that it isn't as clear to us, given our expertise, our experiences, our generation, if you would, what's going on. And that's not just a matter of age, it's also a matter of where we are on the exponential curve of now versus what we're designing for. So that for us is just as important as the building we design. Next slide, please. In the same project, we worked with VS, which is a furniture company who's been designing chairs and desks for effectively schools for the last century out of Germany. One of the best in the world, very much Steelcase's competitor in the higher ed and K-12 market as far as furniture, which is some of the great design in this world now. They supplied a group of high school kids here in Columbus that we were leading with a truckload of furniture from Germany to design an ideal learning environment for the 21st century. And on one level, it was about proximity. It was about material. It was about whether the wheels turned and there was agility. It was about ergonomics. It was about, does the chair allow me to move or do I contort to fit chair, which is a metaphor for all of space and the material side of this. And then midway through, one of the leaders of that company who had flown in from Germany to watch walked up and took a picture of this scene. And I got really nervous because I was their partner, and this was an oh shit moment because they had given me that table. And a lot of business has nothing to do with their expertise. It has to do with, will they stay our partner tomorrow? Will the project team continue and find opportunity? And she took a picture, and I went up to her and I said, I'm sorry, we didn't mean to. And on some levels, we didn't mean to use the space or the furniture the way it was not prescribed. And she said, that's not a problem. She said, I just sent a picture back to the factory saying, make tables that become whiteboards immediately, go now. Now, this is 5.5 years ago. There are endless versions of tables that are whiteboards. 5 or 6 years ago, you couldn't have found a single one in the market. Idea Paint didn't even exist to paint the top of that table. You could have gotten a shower board at Home Depot and hacked a version of it, but it would have ghost printed within 3 or 4 applications. What was interesting is the students weren't solving the problem, how do we make tables into whiteboards, or how do we make a space do X? They wanted this much more privacy and this much more intuitive, just-in-time access to a vertical space to post an idea, and then it collapses and goes away. And what I love about that was, as a designer, if we're trying to inform their behavior but we don't pay attention to the intuitive behavior, we miss perhaps the greatest opportunity. Secondarily, the client, if you would, didn't give anything about the ideal table, chair, space. What they cared about was, can I do what I need to intuitively now, and then pivot quickly to the next. Next 2 slides really quickly, and then I'll shift. Go ahead, I'm sorry if you want to ask. This next one, go back previously. This next one is robbing a story from the D School at Stanford University, which 6 years ago didn't even exist and is now pound for pound probably the most important design school outside of MIT's Media Lab and a couple of architectural programs as well. They didn't exist 7 years ago, which means the entire world of innovation wasn't being informed by this part of Stanford. It's an interesting project where they had a group of undergrads that went over to, I believe to Nepal, may have been Tibet, but I believe it was Nepal, and we're studying the problem of premature babies. And in most hospitals, and this again is an example of behavior, but also of material, also of space, this is how they solve the problem of premature babies in most of the world. Some version of hacking heat source and a way to contain heat source, and that's it. The students thought, what if we designed a great incubator, a perfect incubator? Because effectively the hospital staff had designed incubator based on a desk lamp, rubber tube, and a Tupperware box to hold a preemie alive. 450 babies die per day annually, or per day around the world, simply from being born early. So it's a significant design challenge. When they tried to design the perfect incubator, they did it brilliantly. These are 22, 23, 24-year-old undergrads at Stanford. They went from approximately a $20,000 incubator down to $1,000, which is a pretty good move economically. They multiplied by 3 to 5 in terms of the technology, the technical skill of the incubator. So they created a great business model and a product. They did it within 9 months, and they gave it away to the hospital for free. I would argue in a school of architecture, school of design, school of anything, that might be the greatest example of an A+ you could ever give a group of students. Smart students who come from multiple disciplines, who don't know how to solve a problem, gave it away, lowered the price, increased the ability, and said, we'll figure it out on our free time, not even for their typical class in their typical program. If you go to the next slide, what they realized when they brought it to the hospital is that for 2 weeks, the incubator stayed empty. Not a single doctor or nurse put a single baby into the incubator. Effectively, they solved the problem of incubator, but they failed to realize that the problem was a mother letting go of baby problem, not a perfect object called incubator. Because if the mother doesn't let go, the baby doesn't get to the hospital, there's no point in incubator. And they redesigned and realized the swaddling cloth at the scale of a mother's arm was the technology. The same team within 18 months had released a product called Embrace that kept the baby warm for up to 8 hours without hot water so that that could be transported to the hospital and thus saved by any means necessary. What I like about that project is a reminder that even if we design the perfect solution, we at all points have to also ask, were we asking the right question? And were we willing as a design team to back up and humbly start over, even if we got it right? And that, for me, is an important thing that I wrestle with every day.
And I want to add to that. I think the interesting about that is that, you know, I think in architecture, you know, a lot of times we are more interested in what happened before. When we do research, the precedent, what have been done before, and this is an example of using the same. I mean, well, so that's on one hand. You know, in architecture, we look at the history, but then on the other hand, we say that we are problem solver. You know, that's what we do. We solve problems. And I think, you know, this is an example of using that problem-solving mentality. And obviously, architect, you know, we don't have monopoly in problem-solving expertise. But I think this is one example that I feel like that's something that get people excited about. And not just excited about that, but also it's grounded in observation of how people actually behave and live, you know. And I think, you know, and I want to go back to Christy about, you know, that part of the education. Now, before we talk to that, do you want to talk about the slide that you shared with me, or do you think is a good segue into that, or not?
Sure. Although you can pose, if you have a question you want to ask, then I can use it or not use it.
Okay.
I don't necessarily have.
Because you show it's like an exhibition of some sort. Is that what it is?
Well, it's
Is
a
it a
mode of
conference?
education. It's a mode of it's a mode of having a conversation around
Okay.
architecture.
Okay.
And exhibiting architecture and educating.
Right. Well,
So I
let's
think
look
it's-
at that real quick. Go next.
Okay. Can you go to one of the other? Let's show this one last. Yeah, that one. So I think some of the students. Well, no, it's actually long enough. So I think what this is showing right here is what was a conference that I hosted here at Ohio State in 2013. The premise for this was myself and 3 other colleagues who I'd gone to graduate school had all found ourselves teaching at Midwest institutions within a year or two of one another. And we started to want to have a larger discussion about how do we have a discussion about the mediums of architecture, drawing, model building. You know, obviously we've talked about it already. There had been a huge shift in terms of moving towards representation in a digital realm, but wanting to not just have a conference or do a teaching lab about those skills specifically, but to have a critical conversation in terms of how do we as architects take on new tools, new softwares, new ways of thinking about the production of architecture, the representation of architecture, and have a conversation around that, as opposed to just like, I want to learn how to. Right, so it was meant to have kind of a broader conversation. We felt like none of us could have that, or there was not really an interest to have that conversation alone, and so we sort of developed what became kind of a hybrid model of what we would understand a conference, a symposium, a panel discussion, and a teaching workshop. All into a 4-day event where we invited 16 of our colleagues from universities around the country, 120 students from 4 different institutions, from Kentucky, Michigan, Chicago, and here. And we broke them into topics of thinking about how we draw things, how we model things, how we develop volume or space as an architect. And the students worked in sort of intimate, the workshop model of an instructor who is working on a kind of a specific medium or a specific representation. And as you can see, so those images are from this space here. So I think
what is that? What is on the board?
So what's happening on the right-hand side is kind of the teaching model of how teaching got done in those 3 days, on a Friday, Saturday, and a Sunday. And what's happening on the left-hand side is each of those workshops turning the space that had been their workspace for 3 days into a mini exhibition, right? So that model, we kind of know that, but in architecture, we tend to want to, have a polished exhibition, prepare, to have a separation between the procedural development of an idea and how that artifact gets represented. And so, through the model of kind of the conference and workshop happening kind of simultaneously and culminating in what we sort of afterwards thought of as like a science fair type type exhibition. It wasn't, it was about the artifact of what had been produced, so of course there are things on the table and on the walls that were, but it was much more about opening up a discussion about how we represent architecture, how do we think about architecture, and how do the modes of representation change how we develop it.
And what do you find out?
I think what we determined is that there's a lot more ability for nuance of communication and representation than maybe there was 100 years ago. I also think what it does is it collapses expertise in particular softwares or abilities, because I think unlike the kind of master apprentice model of learning architecture, where I'm going to tell you everything I know in terms of how to build with this material or how to draw with this tool. It collapses that model very quickly to say that teachers and students are kind of learning a lot of these tools together, and it's just being very upfront about that there are certainly, as someone who's practiced architecture or design or someone who's taught it for a certain amount of time, you still bring an expertise and you bring experience, but that's not the fact that a student can arrive at school and expect that they're just going to learn they're going to learn the tools that they need to know to go out into the world. I think what we learned from this is that's not a productive way to think, either as a student or as someone who's teaching.
Do you think there is a constant tension between the school, in the academic setting versus the professional, in the corporate setting or in the practice setting, that the student who graduated obviously can learn a lot, from each other and from teachers or whatnot with these, software or this new way to represent things. But at the end of the day, when they graduated, they may not be able to contribute, in a conventional way in an office setting, right? Like drawing details or even, ceiling plan for that matter. Now, we talked about that a little bit, that you think this is not necessarily the school's kind of responsibility to have them, learn that kind of stuff. For you, it's more of a intellectual and maybe conceptual training. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I'll take some of that. I won't take all of that. And that is that I think that there's a tension between academia and the profession? Absolutely. Do I think that tension should be maintained? Absolutely. I don't think I don't think the role of a teaching institution of any discipline should be to service an industry.
In other words, not a vocational school.
Right.
In some way,
it's
right?
Right. I guess that's one way to think of it. Although I think we ran this model of an architecture conference much more like a vocational program than like an academic conference. Okay. So don't get me wrong. I'm very interested in developing skills, whether that be kind of conceptual, intellectual, or actual problem solving of that. How do I take this and transform it into that, whether it be figuring out how to, work water barrier, vapor barriers in conjunction with building enclosure, or whether that is how do I communicate with this machine in terms of how does it start to do what I want. I think for me those things are not so separate. I think if you spend energy on conceptual and intellectual challenges of normative modes of operation, I think that absolutely becomes of value in a traditional architecture office.
Right.
Even though they haven't spent 4 years learning how to do that singular detail, because who knows what that detail is going to be anyway. Like, I don't even know if that was an ambition that I had. I don't even know how you would
can't
do
learn
that.
enough detail, I suppose.
Right. You can't, like, you couldn't ever do enough hardware schedules to completely be prepared for every nuance that's going to come up on a hardware schedule.
Right.
It's more, I think the better way to approach doing a hardware schedule is to be able to kind of close your eyes and imagine yourself moving through those doors and imagine what is this door operating as? Are there 1,000 people behind me trying to get out this door too because it's a fire? Or is this a door that's working as a threshold between main campus and a building?
Or what the code requires.
I mean, again, I think so spatial is very broad on one hand, yes, but I think being able, that's a really specific application, which I truly believe helps one to do a hardware schedule.
Right.
So I don't know if that
absolutely.
answers your question,
No, I
but
think it does. I think my follow-up question would be, what do you see? So you're describing a way to teach students that you find it somewhat satisfying in your in the conference and everything. Do you see anything more you can do in this setting or the school in general that can make it even better for the sake of what we talk about? Okay, we have different things we need to deal with in the future. We are preparing these students for whatever challenge that they would face. Mm-hmm. Is there other things that you see that the curriculum should accommodate those things, or you think we are doing absolutely optimistically right now?
No, of course. I think there's always ways that curriculums can develop, and I would even move it away from. I think curriculums are slow, and I think the field and the discipline is changing really fast. So while I'm interested in how to make shifts in curriculum, and I spend time thinking about those things, I think the more another productive route for schools and the profession to take advantage of that tension is to do events events that create conversations that have a common platform. Whether that, I have a colleague here in the audience right now who's, we're working on, the identity of the Knowlton School and thinking about, how do you productively have those conversations? Is it in shifting the curriculum? Is it in rethinking the format of how we talk about architecture, how we publish architecture, how we create lectures that then get watched online by other people? How do we create an archive that people can access? I think that these are shifting discussions that I think architecture schools need to rapidly take on. And I think it's not in trade of thinking about the curriculum, but I think it's thinking about a lot of these supplemental things that feed a student's experience and their ability to move into the profession as kind of feeling culturally aware of what that profession looks like right now, and how they potentially see themselves fitting into it now and into the future.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. So Christian, I asked you before this question, but I know that you don't want to answer about, what you want to see from the architecture school. We talk about, you probably would have experience working with some younger graduate that who just, obviously have a very intensive, academic and school at graduate school or whatnot. What is your experience with those younger folks that is, not 5 to 10 years, but like less than 2 year experience? Sure. How do you see them, say, different than your older colleagues?
Sure. So I have the privilege of hiring graduates and hiring young professionals, and also putting teams together that bring a whole spectrum of experience to the table. And so on a daily basis, we're always trying to think, what's a talent we need or a skill set we need? How do we take advantage of the unique personality, attitude, mindset, sort of the way in which they even imagine the problem, but also their role on a team? So there's skills we need, but there's also an attitude, a disposition we also need. Simultaneously, every project isn't a templated cookie cutter of the previous one. And so from that vantage point, here's what I absolutely want to echo that you said, and what I want to recommend is ultimately, no matter how well you do, you'll have to be entirely retrained the moment you start in any organization. I don't care if it's a big global A&E firm and you just won the ticket to the great sort of studio in whatever city, or you're going to work for a very small, intimate boutique, and probably in the next 10 years there'll be very few firms that are more than 25 or 50 or less than 1,000. It's going to be very hard to imagine the economics of a 400-person firm, but that's a whole different discussion. So regardless of where you go, you're going to have to relearn everything. And so the most valuable skill you can bring is an absolute willingness to say, I'll figure it out, and have enough patience to see it through. On the other hand, what is different from the profession is I know that not a single 25-year-old is going to wait and do 10 years of toilet details to hopefully get a shot at partner one day. And if we don't give you something deeply valuable to do early, you will leave. And we will be an 18-month to a 36-month training vehicle for you to start your own studio or to leave the profession or to go to some other studio. So what that means is simultaneously, we absolutely need your mindset. How you approach a problem as a designer is the currency by which you will go forward. Whether or not your portfolio gets you in the door is like any set of GPA or diploma or X. It's something that allows somebody to go, sit down, let's talk. What they're really listening for in most firms is not for you to brag on specs in your portfolio, but instead to describe why you approached the problem, but more importantly, what did you learn when a little bit of reality got tossed in? I think any organization from Google to a non-for-profit down the street would want the same thing. But in my experience in architecture firms, you don't know enough to be worth your salary, but your mind and your willingness and your hunger is irreplaceable. Now, once you get in the door, figuring out politically and psychologically and socially and brand-wise and hierarchy where to position is every young professional's challenge, and that's very true in AD firms. I think it's interesting when just a year or three ago, what was the average unemployment rate for fresh graduates was 12, 13%. That was humbling 2 or 3 years ago for a young 23, 4-year-old anywhere in America. That was hard. And yet we were hiring 22, 23-year-olds all the time, often that were trained really well in architecture, also that brought a whole different spectrum of talents and points of view to the table. So I think in that, the ability to look at problems through multiple lenses rigorously is your great value. Your ability to adapt and understand that the firm, on one hand, needs you to do what they need you to do. There's an org chart. But also, if that's all you're doing at that firm, you've missed the opportunity. You've got to be entrepreneurial. You've got to be scrappy. You've got to position yourself in ways that are outside of the obvious org chart, project team, delineation of schedules, et cetera. That's both in the firm and outside the firm. I think we all have to recognize that going forward, we're in a constant dance between you probably will leave, how do I have access to you no matter where you go next? And even if you leave, how can you be smart enough to still have access to the talent, the resources, the mentoring in that previous studio? And to me, that's one of the great pathways forward. It's not either or, and I love your point about there being a buffer between theory and practice. On some level, yes, it's always going to be true and there should be a buffer. But at the end of the day, are you relevant is always going to be the question. And so to a degree, how can you do what's asked of you because you've been trained in a certain manner? Simultaneously, how can you be unapologetically entrepreneurial and humbly so that you can create opportunities in real time in the studio and in many concentric circles outside of the studio? So often what I'm looking for when I hire somebody isn't what did they do in that studio, but what did they do in their neighborhood simultaneously that applied the same skill set. urban renewal, volunteering, mentoring, and it's that trajectory is ultimately what we're hiring, not can you do exactly what the title in Monster.com or LinkedIn or on our website might tell you. That's rarely what we really need you to do. It's just the most expedient way to figure out who's going to submit a resume. And then that point on, we're looking for something other than what those details are.
And I want to add to that, but I think if I can kind of say it in a different way, it's really think about what we have. We have access to information like never before, right? You can search for anything. You can talk to anybody at anywhere in the world, anytime you want. But a lot of times I feel like what could be taken for granted because of this access is the social skills, right? that we forget that we can actually need to talk to somebody. We need to actually keep in touch with somebody that might come back and we can benefit each other. And that's something I think like you said about the circles and all that. I think that's part of that.
Right. I would also say that I think if we could all agree that a given is that we can ask someone a question at any time in order to get some type of result. I think the thing to be trained on and to consider is what question to ask, right? And I would think that the Possible Mediums project was about taking something like as basic, like the most basic mediums of an architect, like I draw, I model,
right.
I render, I develop space, and saying, how do I draw? How do I model? Right? I mean, like just taking the most basic element and saying, like, even at that level, asking yourself a question, answering that question is going to have like a multitude of results. And I can't even take that most basic medium for granted.
Right.
To me, it's not a lost art. It's extraordinarily beautiful and necessary and primal. And I think it's that and or yes and of can you allow, and I love this, can the process itself become the currency? Not just the final rendering, become the thing I sell you. Because a client will rarely pay for your renderings, but they will often fall in love with how you solve the problem, which is really interesting in the real world. So I think your digital tools are wicked important, but honestly, they're being replaced at the same speed that you're learning them. So it's not important that you learn one tool versus another. It's does the culture of the studio or team or project get aligned with the suite of tools you're using so that it's only important enough to convey the next iteration or prototype or rendering in not a 3DX, but more of like the next way to visually communicate. So that to me is where that analog meets digital is really important. I also think you need to make a movie. You need to be just as good, which you hinted at. If you can't tell a story in video or film terms, and you can only tell it in terms of pulling lines, you're useless soon. But can you and your team tell a multiplicity of stories in terms of the impact of space and behavior and culture and time and daylight and all this? And can you tell that through a spectrum of mediums? Not only do you have a chance of winning projects, but more importantly, you have a better chance of exploring the relevance of that built form and simultaneously always looking for new ways that material and tools and digital and storytelling can work together. So that to me is like bring it all on, but realize none of it's precious.
Right.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you, both of you,
Yeah.
as always.